Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome to the flip video for chapter 6.3. This is video A. Today we'll be talking about World War I and the prosperity that came with it. Let's start off with a little bit of background on World War I. This was supposed to be the war to end all wars. Little did they know. The war began in 1914 and ended 3 years later. The two main groups fighting were the Central Powers, comprised of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey. And they were fighting against the Allied powers, made up of England, France, Italy, and Russia. Now, there's a lot to go into about why the war started, why these countries grouped together, but this is a Washington State history course, so all you need to know who was actually fighting. And you also need to know that at the start of the war, the American president, Woodrow Wilson, decided to keep our country neutral. Now, this was really hard to do because of a lot of people in the United States of America in the early 1900s came from one of the countries that was fighting in the war, whether it be Germany from the Central Powers or maybe France, Italy, or Russia in the Allied powers. So a lot of people had various opinions on whether or not America should go to war, and if they did go to war, who they'd fight with. However, this idea of neutrality, of not fighting in the war, totally stopped when an American passenger ship was sunk by a German U-boat, which was a type of submarine. After this happened, the US of A joined the Allies, and the Selective Service Act came into being, which was a draft for men of the ages 21 to 30. Now, when America finally did enter the war, there was a lot of fear at home. You may be wondering, Mr. Volkman, why would they be afraid? The fighting was in Europe. Well, that would be a great question. And we got to remember this. We are fighting against the Germans. There were a lot of German Americans living in our country, people of German descent, who maybe their father or grandfather was German. Take a moment, pause the video, and if you don't know, ask your parent or someone at home if you have German descent in you. More than likely, you will find that you actually might have some German descent in your blood. I, for one, I definitely do. In fact, my great-great-grandfather fought for Germany and actually kept a journal of his fighting for the year and a half that he fought before he died in the trenches. First off, people were afraid that these German Americans would be disloyal. They are afraid that they may turn on the USA, that they would become enemies working from within. As a result, property owned by German Americans was vandalized. In Seattle, 399 enemy aliens, 990 pro-German radicals, and 449 alleged spies or German agents were arrested by a group of men who were supposed to be looking for disloyal Germans. However, most of these people were found not guilty, and they were actually never brought to court, and they were immediately released. But people were looking for those traitorous German Americans. I encourage you a moment to pause the video to look over these two pictures that I found online. Now, what's a Chapter 6 flip video without talking about our dear friend, the Wobbly? Now, the IWW did not support the war. In fact, the overall IWW group over all of the US of A really wanted their group to focus mainly on the class struggle in America. The poor worker versus the big, mean, bad business owner. And for the most part, I believe the Wobblies did do that. However, Washington State was a little different. They really felt that the war supported big businesses and that it hurt the small workers. In Washington State, they spoke out strongly against World War I. They would organize strikes against companies that supplied tanks, guns, uniforms. In fact, and we'll get to this a little later, the IWW was called in to help a group of lumber workers striking, which really hurt the war effort because they needed the wood. They also were very vocal in speaking out against the war. In fact, in Seattle, they worked very closely with the Socialist Party to fight the war effort. Here are some newspaper clippings, headlines of IWW rallies that were stopped in Seattle. And here's a comic right here, posted by the Wobblies. And I'm going to go to a website right here. And this website actually explains this comic. Again, I encourage you, please pause the video. Take a moment to read through. I'm pointing to the description and you can't see because it's on the computer. But take a moment and read through this. It describes and explains that comic on the slide better. At the very least, if you're not going to read the whole thing, read this part right here at least. Now, tied with the IWW and the Wobblies was this idea of free speech. The Wobblies were speaking out against something they did not believe in, and this caused some problems, as always with the Wobblies. June 15th, 1917, the Espionage Act came into being. This allowed post office officials to ban newspapers and magazines from the mail. I wonder what kind of newspapers and magazines. What do you think? You would be fined and put in jail for interfering with the draft, people who were chosen to work in the army. You also could not interfere with the war effort or give information to the enemy. Now this begs the question, how do you know when you're giving information to the enemy? And how do you know when someone is actually interfering with the war effort? You know, each one has his own opinion. Almost a year later came the Sedition Act. This was a little more specific, and this came with harsher penalties, more prison times. In some aspects, there were up 10 to 20 years worth of prison. With the Sedition Act, you could not interfere with the war effort. You could not insult the government, the flag, the Constitution, or the military. Interesting. You also could not try to stop the production of war supplies. Finally, you could not advocate or encourage or teach people to do any of these above things. Now, who do you think this was aimed at during World War I? If you thought the Wobblies, you were definitely correct. It was definitely aimed at the Wobblies and the Socialist Party and a lot of different labor groups. Here's a comic put out definitely having a strong opinion about the Sedition Acts. What do you think? Is this comic for the Sedition Acts or against it? What do you think? If you said against, you would be correct. Now, real quick before I go to the last slide, you are going to have an extra credit question that has a lot to do with this free speech of World War I in relation to what's going on now in our country. Not so much now, but definitely a few years ago. I think it's a very interesting conversation we can have. And as always, I'm hoping you can see both sides of a story or an argument. Finally, let's talk about World War I and Washington State's economy. First off, farmers, loggers, and food packers in our state benefited hugely from the war because we were supplying, at first, lots of supplies to our allies. You know, when we were neutral, we were giving them lots of supplies, lots of food, lots of other supplies to help them with their war effort over in Europe. Lumber prices climbed to record levels. Washington Forest supplied lumber for ships, for army posts, and airplanes. Now, in the summer of 1917, 40,000 to 50,000 men went on strike in the lumber industry. They wanted an 8-hour workday and better conditions. It was so bad, lumber production came almost to a halt, and the government sent in the Secretary of War, and also Governor Lister of Washington State came in to force the owners to give in to these demands. Now, because there was such a high demand for lumber, owners could not keep up with this demand. And as a result, there was poor quality. So the army sent men in to help. There was about 5,000 soldiers went in, and in the end, 100,000 civilians signed up to make logging camps, to bring in roads and railroad tracks to different tree stands that could not be reached. Also, the wood and shipbuilding industry became the second biggest industry in Washington state, only behind lumber. When we started the war, we had one shipbuilding company. In the end, 25. Another company was also started by a man named William Boeing, which we all know as Boeing, and has become one of the biggest industries in our state. Well, thank you for listening to this flipped video. Hope you enjoyed it. Please go to Modo and do the questions there.